I'm Peggy Osterkamp. I took my first weaving class in 1970. In 1981, I started teaching my passion, and I've taught hundreds of students since. I've written magazine articles and books and taught workshops across the country. In this video, I'll show you how to wind the warp and dress the loom back to front by yourself. Since it's a method that can be used for all yarns and projects, I think it's the best way for beginners to learn. In addition to a warping board, a loom, and a reed, these are some of the things that you'll need. Yarn for the warp, yarn or string for the guide string, some string for tying the crosses and choke ties and other things at the loom, scissors, yardstick, and a kite stick. This is a stick that is not a dowel, it has square edges, and it's to wind the yarn up when it comes off the warping board and before it's put on the loom. This is a canvas stretcher bar, which I like because it's lightweight and smooth and they're easy to come by. And a raddle. The spaces should not be any bigger than a ½ inch. And this is for winding the warp onto the loom and spreading the warp out to the width that we've determined that we want it to be. And a piece of paper to cover the teeth. A pair of leaf sticks, sticks with holes in the ends. An end stick. It also has holes in the ends. It needs to be wider than the width of the warp, but not wider than the loom. 3 or 4 packing sticks. They don't need to have holes, but it's okay if they do. A heavy book or some rubber bands and some clamps, and I like these clamps a lot. There's a trigger here that you can open them and close them, and then when you get it close, then you can squeeze that and it tightens it up really tight. Packing paper, adding machine tape, broom handle, scotch tape, and a tape measure. A threading hook, a sleigh hook, something for a weight. I like to use a wrench, the draft of course, and a low stool for threading. For this demonstration, the warp is 3/2 cotton at 1,260 yards per pound. The set is 6 EPI, or 6 ends per inch. The width is 10 inches, and the total length is 4 yards, and that includes the loom waist. And that's the amount of warp that can't be woven, where it's attached to the front and the back of the loom. So to figure out how much yarn we need, we have 6 ends per inch times 10 inches wide equals 60 threads, or 60 ends. Each thread is 4 yards long, so 4 yards times 60 ends equals 240 yards of warp is what we need. Step 1 is measuring the warp. I've measured my guide string 4 yards long, and I'm going to tie a loop in one of the ends. I'm using an overhand knot, but any old knot would work. We just really want to have a loop. And the 4 yards starts at the top of the loop. I want 4 pegs in a row at the beginning of the warp because I want to make the cross between those 2 pegs. So I drape out the yarn until I get to the 4-yard point where I made a knot. Because very often the 4-yard point doesn't hit at a peg, I made the knot and cut it about a foot longer. So I'm going to make the warp longer rather than shorter. I'm going to undo that knot, and I'm going to come down here, tie the end, and here I wanted 4 pegs as well because another cross is going to be made down here. This cross will be made for the raddle, and that will be made of groups of threads. Now I can measure the real warp threads, and I'm going to start with a loop again. And one knot I like to tie when I have only one tail is a double half hitch. You make a loop and take the tail through, and make another loop and take the tail through again. That makes a nice loop. Now I'm going to follow the guide string, going under the first peg, over the second, around here, following the path, and making the cross down here. Now this cross is going to be made of 3 threads. So 3 threads are going to follow the same path, because that's how many threads are in a 1/2 inch worth, which is the space between the nails and the raddle. Up here, we're going to alternate and make the regular weaver's cross, which people are used to making, where we go under the peg and over the peg every other one. So I'm coming back under and over. Now this is the 3rd thread, so it's going to follow the same path, but the 4th thread is going to follow the other half of the cross. So it's on the left of the peg and then on the right of the peg. And you want to keep pushing the threads back so you're measuring with where the pegs are coming out of the warping board. Here again, under over and under over. That makes the 3 for the second group. Here's the under, over again, and on the return, under, over again. So they're alternating, not in groups. This thread by thread cross keeps the threads precisely in order. The cross itself is right there where the threads cross, and we can see them, keeping them in order as they're crossing, right in here. We need this thread by thread cross for threading the loom later, where we want everything to be in order. That will keep the threads all the same length, and we'll avoid having a bunch of spaghetti at the end. And that would be a real mess. So this is a very, very valuable tool, this threading cross. This group cross is here for the raddle. There are 3 threads in each group because there are 3 threads in each raddle space, which is a 1/2 inch. If you look below it, a false cross develops. That just happens. You don't want to pay any attention to it. It just is there, but it is not the cross. This is the cross that you're interested in. And after 5 groups, and I have 5 here, I'm going to put in a counting string. I doubled a long string, folded it, and I'm going to crochet around that group of 5. Keeping a big loop and a big tail and letting them dangle. They'll be used then to crochet the next 5. And this is a nice way to count, so that you don't have to count. If you have 500 threads, it's easy to count by the groups. And this counting thread will pull out with a jerk when you're finished with it. Continue warping. Don't want to make it too tight. If it's too tight, it'll bend the pegs. So a nice even tension. And that's easy to do. It just comes. The thing is to remember not to do it too tight. And you want to keep pushing it back. Always the buildup should be pushed back. So you're measuring against the wood, and you're measuring close to where the pegs come out of the board. They have a tendency, they could bend a little bit if you were measuring out there, so always push that back. When it's time to change colors, just cut the old one, join the new one to it. I use an overhand knot, but anything will do. The knot doesn't have to hit exactly on the peg. And continue with the crosses just going along as usual. I think I'll cut that. I like to make the ties at the top so that it's smooth down here at the raddle end. But if it's necessary to make the tie at the bottom because of the color sequence that I want, I do that too. But it's nicer to have a smoother, smooth join when we join this end to the loom. Remember, when you're making the groups, this is where you do that. the last group was on this side of the peg and crossed to that side. So this is the start of the new group. It's coming on the left side of the peg, crossing over onto the right, and coming around the end peg and following the exact same path. And that was 2 threads. So I need 3, so I'm going to follow the exact same path to make the third. Push it back. And now I'm going to start a new group. The old one was here. The new one starts here, crosses over to here, and comes up. That's the first one in that group. I'm going to follow the exact same path because there's only 1 thread in the group so far. This one has to come over here, and then over here, around the bottom, and follow the exact same path to make the third thread in the group. So again, on the other side, come back, follow the same path. The cross is happening right in here. It's time to make the counting string crochet again. I have 5 groups made, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I take the loop and draw a loop through that loop from the tail. Push it all back, tighten it down, leaving the tail, leaving the loop to ready for the crochet the next group. I'm going to continue on just like that until I have 4 groups, my 60 threads. Uh-oh, I have a knot. We don't want that in the middle of the warp, so I'm going to go back to the beginning and cut it out. And just as though I were tying a new color to the old, I'll just tie a knot here, an overhand knot, and continue on. Now here's the last thread, making the last cross, and I'm going to tie it off in a loop like I did before at the beginning. Make a loop, take the tail through, make another loop, take the tail through. Then that knot will just drop off later when you're ready to thread. Now I'm going to tie off the crosses so when it comes off the warping board, we'll know where those pegs were. And I'm going to color code the ties. So on the top of the peg is the red string, and on the bottom, the gray. And I'm making a half bow, start of a shoelace knot for the beginning part, and then end up with a slip knot. That's secure enough, and then it will come out nicely. So here, again, is red on top. Slip knot on top. And a gray half bow below. This is especially good if you have just one color, and you might get a twist in the warp when you're putting it on the loom. I have 2 more ties here at the end peg. So I'm going in the loop with my color-coded string, and I'm careful not to get the guide string. And I'm going to tie on top of the peg as usual. And one at the bottom of the peg in the loop, not catching the guide string. Of course, I want to tie the ties at the bottom. I'm going to tie them just the same as the top on either side of the cross, color coding, red on one side, gray on the other, and very important to tie on either side of the end peg, keeping the color consistent. The color coding on one side and the other doesn't have to relate to the top. It's just that we want all one color on this side and another color on this side. Now I'm going to tie the choke ties. They should be about every yard. and it needs to be really, really tight. So go around the bundle 2 times before you start making the knot. See how much tighter I can get it. Now make the same half bow. When the threads are off the warping board, they're going to be slack, and so having the choke ties periodically lets you know where the threads should lie together. Tie the choke ties about 1 yard apart. Now all the ties are made, the end peg, the cross, the choke ties, the raddle cross, and its end peg, and I can take out the counting string now. I'm going to take the warp off now, up at the thread cross end, and I'm going to slip it off like this, and in that loop that we tied, I'm going to make a lark's head knot and put it on the kite stick. So I'm going to put my fingers like that and reach through that loop, grab the warp, and make a nice, easy, as big as I like, lark's head. And I'm going to tighten it up around the kite stick. I like to start winding the kite stick with the warp coming off to the left and the loop of the lark's head behind it. And I'm going to go behind the stick, and I'm going to make an X here and here. So I'm behind the stick, coming up, that's half the X, and here is the other half of the X. Then I'm going to turn and make an X on this facet. And I'm going to turn and make one on this facet. The key is to hold all of this right here where the warp is, not down where the stick is. It works a lot like a niddy-noddy. I'm kind of digging with the stick when I make the X, and digging with the stick. And this keeps all the threads under tension. Many weavers make a chain instead of this, and the threads aren't under tension. And this is really a nicer way to do it, especially with linen and other jumpy threads. And I just let it sit there. You might put a rubber band around it, or you might tuck the tail in if you need it. But what we want is the raddle cross end now available, which we have. Sometimes the warp is too big to go on the warping board and we need to be made in sections. In that case, each section would have its own kite stick. Step 2 is loading the raddle. First, put the lee sticks in the raddle cross and tie them about 1 inch apart. Then put in the end stick in the end loop, and here's where the color coding ties really help. See, they're all red. If it had been this way when I put the stick in, with the gray tie showing, I would have known there was a twist in the warp. This doesn't show so much because we have a stripe in the warp, but if it were a solid color, it would be very easy to get a twist. So color code the ties, have all the same color, and tie the end stick with the loops on it. Again, I'm using that double half hitch, which is nice when you have just one tail. Make a loop, take the tail through it. And then you want to make sure that the ties are tight and secure. Then all the color-coded ties can come out. And the warp is ready. It makes it easier to see the cross if you have a weight on the warp and pull against it. And then it's very easy to see the separations of the cross, the groups. So next comes the raddle. And we're just going to load each group into the sections. I measured out 5 inches from the center because it's going to be 10 inches wide. And that's where I started. So this is why it's so nice to make that raddle cross. It's just easy to load this, plunk, plunk, plunk. And the paper is there to keep the teeth of the raddle from snarling the threads. And then we want to make sure that there are no mistakes. So push the leaf sticks up near the raddle and check that there are no mistakes. And then secure the warp in there by putting rubber bands across. I usually use more than one, and you don't want it too close to the bottom of the raddle because the warp is going to pass through the space between the rubber bands and the raddle. So that was easy. Loading the raddle with the raddle cross is just really, really easy. Now it's time to take out the leaf sticks. So I'm going to undo that knot and pull them out. Step 3 is winding the warp on the warp beam. This is also called beaming the warp. If the back beam of the loom is flat, you can just attach the raddle simply with rubber bands. It needs to be secure. However, if the back beam is on a slant, we can't use the rubber bands, we'll use clamps. This loom I'm using has a slanted back beam. Make sure that the apron cords are wound up smoothly and in the right direction. If the brake is a ratchet brake on the loom, you'll hear the right direction by hearing the clicking of the ratchet, and you know it's going in the right direction. This loom has a tension brake or friction brake and no teeth, so you must pull against it to make sure that it's holding. Now I'm going to put the warp on the back beam. It needs to be tight and secure, and it needs to be absolutely centered. So you measure on the back beam and out to the frame of the loom. Don't measure on the warp beam where part of the warp beam has a break on it, one side. The other side does not have the break. So to get it exactly centered, measure to the frame of the loom that matches the other frame on the other side. This may look wrong to you with the bulk of the warp coming off the back of the loom going that way when you know in the end it's going to have to go that way. But there are advantages of doing it this way, which you'll see as I go along. I wound up the apron rod so it sits on top of the warp beam. That will make it easy for me to bring the end stick down and sit it on top so that it's not fiddly at all to tie these two together. And I'm going to tie the middle one first. I've doubled my string so that it's really strong. And I'm going to tie the knot on the edge of the stick, not on the top there, because I don't want any lumps. Again, the half bow is good because it's strong and it comes out when you need it. Then about 3 inches from there, or a little less, on either side of that center bundle we'll get ties. Half bow. If you didn't have the apron rod wound up like that, this whole thing would be very tippy and hard to tie them in air. But that's what makes people nervous. So you don't want to be nervous. You don't want to worry that you're going to lose the whole thing. 2 more ties, one on each end. Not going to tie the length of the stick at all, just the length that the warp is. And here's the last tie at the other end. Now I'm going to wind 1 revolution of the warp beam. And this is where we want to settle the end loops. Because you see, these are, since it's a loop, if this is loose on one side, it's going to be tight on the other. So this might take a little fiddling, and it might be that you have to undo the ties, but very often if you just wriggle the stick a little bit, and I'm pulling on the choke tie. Now I think they look like they're all even. There are no loopy ones and no tight ones. Now I'm going to wind 1 revolution, and I know when a revolution is because the stick is on the top. And then I'm going to tension this warp, and we want the warp to be on very, very, very tight, like a spool of sewing thread, that tight as we can make it. So to do that, I'm going to come around to the back of the loom, and after every revolution, I'm going to jerk the warp. I've heard this called crank and yank. So I've cranked, now I'm going to yank. And what I'm doing is tightening up what's been wound up, because I have to let these go. And about 2-inch sections. And then it's time to crank again. So I'm going to crank 1 more time. And I'm going to yank starting from this side and work that way. And this is the advantage of having the bulk of the warp coming out here. You can crank and yank without having to go walking around to the other side of the loom to do your tensioning every time you crank. So you don't have to worry too much about the threads themselves. And could you see them tightening up down here? Notice I haven't put any paper in. And about 1 more crank, and then I'm going to put paper in. And the paper doesn't need to be continuous because I'm tightening this so tight that the layers of warp can't bite down into one another. So here's tightening again. Now I'm ready to put a piece of paper in, a packing paper. It doesn't need to be continuous because this warp is on so tight, the outer layers are not going to be able to bite down. But the reason for the paper is to keep these edges so they stack up right on top of one another coming from the raddle. They don't slide down and slip off. The paper doesn't need to be continuous, so I use pieces that are about the length of the circumference of the warp beam. And notice that paper was cut quite a bit wider than the warp is, and folded in 1 inch on each side. That is to make the edges stiffer so that they do their job. Start the paper and catch it in, and hold the paper right here in the center. That will keep it from going on askew. Again, do 1 revolution and crank. And yank. Hold the paper here so that it doesn't go askew. And yank. So I can use the crank or turn it by hand. Now it's time to undo a choke tie again. We don't like that triangle. All the threads need to be going on parallel. Now they can go on parallel. And I can't remember, am I ready to yank? If I'm not sure, it would just be a good idea to yank again. Well, I think it's time for another piece of paper. I put it in when I feel like the edges might be starting to roll down. So start it, hold it here, go round one revolution. And again, the advantage of having the warp coming off the back of the loom is so that you can do the crank and yank. If it were going the other way, you would crank here and then have to walk over to the front of the loom and do your yanking. So this is how you can put the warp on really well and really tight and alone without a helper. I hope you can see here what the rattle's job is. It's spreading the warp out to the precise width that we want, and so that all the threads are going on perfectly parallel and perfectly straight. You measured them carefully at the warping board. They should be put on carefully so that they stay all the same length. And I said before that 1/2 inch spaces are about the biggest that you would ever want. If you had 1 inch spaces, say, that would make too many threads in a group, especially if you had really thin threads. Now, if you had really fat threads, probably it would be okay. But the threads will mix up a little bit in the groups, so you don't want too many. Now, if you had 15 ends per inch, let's say, how would you do that on the warping board? Because a 1/2 inch space would have 7 threads or 8 threads. Well, life is short, so you would want to choose either 7 or 8 and make all the rattle groups the same size. So the way to determine which 7 or 8 you would use is, the rule is you want to have the warp wider on the back beam than it will be woven. So if you had 8 threads in a section, the warp would be narrower. So you would choose 7 threads in each 1/2 inch section, so you would widen out the warp. Sometimes it may look like you have some tangles. The threads aren't really separating exactly between the rattle groups. And you may pick at them with your finger or and separate them. Probably all you have to do is just jerk on them, and that will straighten them out. Sometimes the threads can look pretty tangled, and usually if you just take them and slap them like that, there they go. You may pat them or strum them, but just slapping them will do the job. It might be that things aren't quite so neat and tidy as you'd like at the choke tie. See, all these threads are nice and taut, and even these green ones over here, but these are loose. And we want them all to go on the same tension, so we're going to have to take out that choke tie and jerk and move the extra slack back. So when we jerk, we'll be jerking them all equally, and that loose thread, or bunch of threads, will just get pushed back along the warp. It's really important to watch for twists and messes here at the rattle, and mostly those can come out by spanking or strumming or pinching. But there's one tangle that you might find a thread getting very tight, and that is because it has jumped out of that rattle space into the next space, and you'll be sure that you'll think, wow, this is in the wrong space, but it's getting tight. So those are 2 clues. So you'll have to unwind until you get to this point where it jumped over the nail, and then when you take it out over the nail, you'll release that. Won't be tight anymore. Before I finish this warp, I'd like to warn you about unbalanced or singles yarns. They can roll on themselves just without anything that you do. They just normally will do that. These yarns are balanced that we've been using, and see how they lay flat and are orderly. One thing you can do, you can try with your fingers or a stick, is to sort them out. But if they're just huge tangles, that's not going to work. And if you encounter these terrible twists, you'll have to start with the other end of the warp and put the lead sticks in the thread by thread cross. Then load the raddle groups. And when you beam, the warp will go through the groups as well as the individual thread by thread cross, so that the threads are not going to be allowed to twist. You could use packing sticks instead of paper, but I don't like to use them usually because it builds up the warp beam too much. But the reason you would really need to have packing sticks is if these apron cords were lumpy at the very, very beginning of the warp, and you would want to span those cords and wind it in so that you're building up a very smooth base for the warp, so that all the threads will be exactly the same length. So whenever the warp is ready to hit the warp beam, another stick. Now you want the sticks to all be parallel with each other, so you may have to adjust them as you go. It looks like we're finished winding now. You want to leave about the amount from the back of the loom to the front unwound so that you can thread the heddles and the reed and tie on. So it's time to remove the raddle. And now is the crucial step. The warp is going away from the loom. It needs to be going that way to the heddles, but you must take it under the back beam and over it, pointing toward the front of the loom. Don't worry that this looks a little messy. It's not a problem. Everything is nice and tidy on the warp beam. It's so important that it goes over the back beam, because if you don't have it going over there, you won't get a shed and you won't be able to weave. Step 4 is threading the heddles. The most important thing, so you won't make mistakes, is to get comfortable. The first thing is to hang a broom handle off the back of the castle, or if you don't have a castle, perhaps off the back of your last shaft. Use bows so it can be adjusted, so when we can adjust the height later. The next step is to raise the shafts. It can be done in any way that your loom will do. Maybe tie this to the castle, maybe prop up some jacks. This loom has a place here I can put a stick, and that will prop them up. It may be that you'll weight the treadles. Now I want to put the leaf sticks in the cross. Here's where we tied them on the warping board. The sticks go in. And want to make sure there's no twists. I think we need to turn this around so that the stripe is on the right side. And then these get tied an inch apart. And make sure that tie is secure. Now, these ties that held the cross can be removed. And the warp and the leaf sticks and all are going to go over the broom handle, so that the cross is going to be hanging between the broom handle and the heddles. Now I'm going to move the cross up along the warp so it's even with the heddle eyes. Now it will be much easier to see for threading. And the top leaf stick is going to get tied to the broom handle. So nothing will be tippy, everything will be secure. You can thread and stop and answer the phone if you want to. This is going to be with bows again so that it can all be adjusted to when you sit in front of the loom so that everything is at eye level and comfortable for you. Now I'm going to cut off the loop end. Undo the ties that were there if they're left, and weight these warps with a lark's head knot in the rubber band. I would weight about the amount that's the thickness of a carrot. That's about how thick this warp is, so that's how much I would do the whole warp. But if you had a big warp, you just do a section. And when the weight is on it, it's very easy now to see the threads in the cross, and that will make threading much, much easier. I'm going to be at the front of the loom when I thread the heddles, so I'm going to turn the loom around so that you can see more clearly. This is the threading draft, and I put it on a piece of adding machine tape. The threading draft starts on the right and goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I put rows of 4 numbers on the adding machine tape. This will make it easier to thread in a few minutes. However, if you have a complicated repeat, you may want to mark the repeat on the adding machine tape. Here the repeat is 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, made a mark. That's the end of one repeat. Then we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2 again. Here's the end of a repeat. And if you get out the heddles for that whole repeat, then when you finish the repeat, you should end up with no more heddles, and you shouldn't have a mistake in there. If you did, at least that heddle would be in that repeat area for later fixing it up. Another way to get comfortable is to take out the beater if possible. In this case, we can just take out the top of the beater and the reed, but that will get it so that it's much more comfortable for you to see what you're doing. The next is to count out the heddles you need. You know we have 60 threads, and counting from the draft, I counted that there were 10 to be on shaft 1, so I have 5 heddles on either side of the center. For shaft 2, there should be 20 threads, so I need 20 heddles, and I have 10 on each side of the center. I've done the shafts 3 and 4 as well. Push the excess heddles out to the sides. The next thing for getting comfortable is that low threading stool I mentioned. You want to be so that your eyes are at the same level as the heddle eyes. Then go to the adding machine tape and pull out the heddles that are indicated for the row. So the first row is 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I've undone the hooks at the top and the bottom of the heddles and pushed all the heddles over to the left so they're out of the way, and when I pull the ones I want, 1, 2, 3, 4 over here to the right, and I take the first 4 threads from the cross and I put them in my fingers like a claw. So that's the first thread. The second thread is going to be here, the third thread here, and the fourth thread there. See how they are coming in order from the cross. This is thread number 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're in my claw hand. I'm going to curve that around. Here's the threading number 1. Get it in there. Number 2. Three, and the last one 4. And then tie them with a slip knot. Make the slip knots far away from the heddles, not really up close, so they really can dangle. Notice I'm keeping the threads in the cross. I'm not pulling them out. Now that I've finished that row, I move the pin. And I'm ready to get out 3, 2, 1, 2. It's easier to count, to see where your shafts are if you look down here. 3, 2, 1, 2. And the reason for doing 4 is because you can keep those numbers, 4 numbers, in your head. 3, 2, 1, 2, while you're over here. So here's the 3, 2, 1, 2. Then I get out the threads from the cross for my claw. Don't worry if they're tangled up here. That's not a real tangle. That'll all come out. It's down here at the cross where the threads are in order. So 3, 2, 1, 2. Here's the 3. Here's the 2. And notice my thumb sort of helps to stabilize the heddles sometimes when they're wiggling around. Okay. Slip knot. Now I've finished that row, so I'm going to move the pin. Next I'm going to get out 3, 4, 3, 2. 3, 4, 3, 2. So you're not thinking about how the draft was. All you're thinking of 3, 4, 3, 2. And that's a good way to keep from making mistakes. You're just looking and thinking about 4 threads at a time. 3, 4, 3, 2. It's easy for me to go over and quickly check my adding machine tape. The pin shows me what's been done. 3, 4, 3, 2. So by doing it in stages, it's another way to keep from mistakes. You're getting it in your hand in order. You're concentrating on how they come from the cross. You're getting it in your hand. You've done the heddles, and then you put them together and move the pin. Now we're back to 1, 2, 3, 4. It's very important that these are in order, or your cloth won't be the same design that you figured it out to be. 3, 2, 1, 2 is next. Now it's important that the threads come from your claw in the right order, but they also have to come through the heddles in the right order. So we know that 2 is next, and here's the 2. If you take the 2 here, and the 1 is back in here, if you take the 1 next, because you know you need the 1 next, those threads are going to be crossed. So you see we have 3, 2, and then 1, 2. These 2 are crossed. So that would be a big problem. You couldn't weave that way. You would have to fix that. So it's very important. If you have 3, 2 comes next, it can't come around another heddle. The heddles must be in absolute order. First the 3, then the 2, then the 1, then the 2, to keep the threads from crossing. Now I'm going to finish up by fixing up that 2. And sometimes when you have a mistake, I feel like it's like the gremlins are there, and there might be another mistake. And I've been known to put the same mistake back in when I'm thinking I'm correcting it. So check carefully. I'm saying, yes, this is on 3, and I'm looking down here at the bottom of the shaft so I can see easily that that's 3. The next thread is 2. I'm looking down there. Yes, it is on shaft 2. Then 1, and then 2. They're coming out exactly parallel. Nobody is crossed over. And I've set my heddles like this so that they're staggered on the shafts. So it's easy for me to pull them out. And I've pushed them way to the side so I have all this room for threading. So whether you're threading really fine threads or not, you're only concentrating on the 4 threads at a time, and you have plenty of room to see what you're doing and to move your hands. Then they get pushed aside. By making the knots 5 or 6 inches away from the heddles, they won't tangle around the heddles and cause problems later. I'll finish threading the heddles, then we'll be ready to slay the reed. Our 60 ends stops on shaft 2, the end of a repeat, and that's just fine for fabric or yardage. But if you were making a scarf where the pattern showed, you might want to add a 1 here, 1 more thread on shaft 1, which would balance this side with the other side. Step 5 is slaying the reed. This is a tip I just learned from a friend. She put white tape along one edge of the reed so that dark threads will be easy to be seen. The dark side can be used for light threads. I like to mark the center of my reeds with a string. We're going to stabilize the beater in the middle somewhere, so we're going to tie one side to the castle and one side to the front of the loom. Use bows so that it can be adjusted when we get into position so that everything will be comfortable. The reed needs to be centered in the loom, and the warp needs to be centered in the reed, so I've measured out 5 inches from the center because our warp is 10 inches wide. Now, how you position the reed depends on the loom, and it's really an eye thing most of all. It can be on an angle like this, it could be vertical like this, and some people like to have the reed flat or horizontal. And you can put in Larry sticks, just 2 long sticks from front to back, and balance the reed on that. And thread the reed like this. This is the position that I like for the beater to be, at an angle. And many looms allow you to sit this reed right in at an angle and it's stable. If not, you'll have to put on the beater cap to hold it vertically. I start with the first 4 threads in the claw, then thread 1 dent at a time. And when I put the thread through the reed dent, I'm just keeping it on the hook, reaching then back for the next thread from the claw. Keep it on the hook and move to the next dent. Then they can all be pulled out together. This keeps you from making mistakes because your eyes are always looking here at the dents and the hook moves from one dent to the next without making a mistake. In many situations, there are more than 1 thread per dent. In that case, if there were 2 per dent, you would have 2 in your claw hand between each finger. Once I've finished slaying the reed, we'll be ready to tie on. Step 6 is tying the warp onto the apron bar. Since this warp is only this wide, we're going to slip off these outer straps. This will prevent this stick from bowing. You only want the attachment to the apron cord to be for the width that the warp is. If it were way out here, it would bow. Do the center bundle first. That will keep the apron bar stable. And you want to smooth the threads out so any loose ones will be worked back. I'm taking an inch worth and I'm going over the bar, dividing it approximately in half. And I'm going to tie a surgeon's knot. It starts like a shoelace knot, the beginning of a shoelace knot, and you just repeat that. Take the tail through one more time. That gives a stronger bite. After the first bundle is tied, it's time to lower the shafts. I'm going to take out my sticks, and to lower the broom handle assembly so that we have a straight shot from the back beam to the front beam. And we want to leave the leaf sticks in, and they should balance pretty well because the center bundle is tied. They'll stay stable as soon as the rest of the bundles get tied. Now you can continue tying the bundles. This one won't be even and will have to be redone, but you'll tie one on each side of the center, pinching like this so that any loose threads are moved along so that they're all the same tension from the back beam. Over the bar, divide it about in half, and tie the surgeon's knot. The beginning of a shoelace knot done 2 times. So you work out from the center. And the bundle should be about an inch in width, not more. So pinch, pinch, pinch. You don't want to comb. Pinch, pinch, pinch. Over the bar. Divide it in half. And tie the surgeon's knot. Now, after you have these 2 tied, you can adjust the middle one. And it would be good to start the whole process over. Pinch, pinch, pinch so that all the threads are on even tension. Over the bar. And the surgeon's knot. And next is going to come a trick. And the ties need to be on the top here, because you may want to adjust those bundles later. The goal is to get the warp all in the same tension all the way across. So the trick is, after you've tied a bundle on each side, advance the cloth beam a click or 2. And then make the next pair of bundles on either side from the middle, working out from the middle. Pinch, pinch, pinch. So after this bundle, I'll do a click again. And how many clicks you do makes a difference. Because on your loom, you may have a ratchet that has big clicks or little ones. Now, I see a mistake in the reed that passed my eye. So that's going to have to be taken care of before we go any farther. This isn't too difficult to fix. You'll unslay and reslay in one operation. Put the hook in the empty dent and behind the reed, grab the thread that should belong to it. And you'll just follow along. Put your hook into the empty dent, hook up the thread that belongs in it, and pull it through. Put your hook into the empty dent, hook up the thread that belongs in it, and pull it through. And you can see I'm working my way dent by dent to the edge of the warp. I'll retie this bundle, then do the click, and then be ready to finish the rest of the bundles. Now I have them all tied, I want to check to see that the tension is even. And it feels all even to me with a nice click trick. If one is loose, it's definitely loose. If it's tight, it's tight. If you can't tell, it's okay. So you don't want to agonize over that step. If you need to readjust the tension on a bundle, it's easy to get that knot out. Just loosen it, and then with the heels of your hands on the bar, you can tighten it or loosen it. Now, if you have a slippery yarn, it may be that you're going to want to tie a slip knot or a rest of a square knot on top of these. But for most yarns, I just finished with the surgeon's knot. And there you have it. The warp is ready to go. See how easy it is to warp from back to front? As you can see, there are many advantages to warping back to front. Namely, the warp isn't subjected to the stress of going through the reed and the heddles twice, once during warping and once during weaving. Another advantage is that the warps are joined to the warp beam apron without any knots. This knotless join provides even tension on each warp thread and a smooth surface on which to wind the warp. I like to leave the lee sticks in during weaving. It helps keep the threads in order as they're headed toward the heddles. Most of this I learned from Jim Ahrens, but I also learned a lot from my students and from my teachers, and the process continues as I share with you.